Hi, this is Nisha. In this video is looking at a very infamous pistol. This is the Japanese Type 94 Nambu. While the Type 14 was standard issue for Japan during World War II and was produced in relatively large numbers, there was also the Type 94. And this was kind of a specialist's gun. After the Type 14 was in full production, and after the Kakibunji factory was up and producing it, Kaijiro Nambu designed the pistol specifically to suit the needs of flyers, tankers, and other people needing a compact gun. He did this at the request of the Japanese Army, and he based it on a design he had been working on for a few years. But the request came in 1934. And by the end of the year, he had a prototype that was accepted as the Type 94. This gun is substantially different than the Type 14. It still fires the 8mm bottleneck, the 8x22 cartridge. We still have a cocking in the back. But now we have an internal hammer and a more traditional firing pin to go with. We still have a last round on the open mag, empty mag to hold it open with no actual manual hold open. Let's see here. See? Still have a locked breech, of course. We feed from a nickeled 6-shot mag with a flat base. We still have a nice grip angle, although it's a rather small grip by American standards. We have a mag release in a very normal position. Instead of the rather awkward safety of the Type 14, we have a thumb safety here, which is pretty familiar. Actually, very usable safety. As I said, we're hammer fired. We do also have a magazine disconnect safety here. Pull this out. Lip raises to block the trigger from being pulled. We have fixed sights. And we have a fixed lanyard ring. These would go into production around the middle of 1935 at the Kakibunji factory, and when it was reorganized as Chuokojo in 1936, they would of course continue. And that would be the only factory to produce the Type 94. In the beginning, production numbers were quite small and slow, although this was a little cheaper and faster to produce than the Type 14, which is kind of good. We have synthetic checkered grips here. Early guns have a scalloped frame down here. It's kind of rounded out on both sides. We also have a so-called kind of tail on the back of the sear here. You can see me moving it. They're well machined. Originally, this one has seen quite a bit of use, but originally they had nice high-grade bluing, strawed small parts, and as you saw, a nickeled magazine. They would kind of change up the checkering on the grips in the 1930s, going from small to large to medium. They would, kind of change patterns here and there, but it would remain more or less consistent for the first few years of production of the guns. However, in 1940, they would introduce some changes. This is a gun from, this gun, by the way, was made in 1937. This gun here was made in 1941. And since it was made before World War II, it still has very high-grade bluing. It still has the strawed small parts. We still have a nickeled magazine. Still have the synthetic grips. These have a slightly different checkering pattern than the first ones. But we've kind of stopped doing the scalloping, the lightning cuts, whatever, on the frame here. It's just squared off now. We've also deleted the tail on the sear here. It's just flush. There's really no great reason for these changes because they were done before World War II even really kicked off in the Pacific Islands. But I guess they saw some ways to streamline manufacturing and took them. I mean, even they were producing Type 14s and they wanted to keep 94 production as reasonable as possible. This was a secondary gun in a sense, and it was meant for specialists. It wasn't really for general issue. But again, the early guns are still well made. There would be a production jump. They would start to kind of make them in larger numbers around 1940. And then, of course, after World War II began, they would ramp up production quite a bit at the Kokubunji factory. Also, in 1942, they would stop using the nickeled magazines and start bluing them. And sometime in 1943, they would drop the straw coloring on the parts and go to blued parts. And after 1943, the quality of the machining and bluing would go down quite a bit. You'll see some pretty darn rough Type 94s from 1944. In fact, they got so rough at one point they had to kind of go in and reorganize the factory and replace a few people to up the quality a little bit. Guns like this, which were produced, and this was made in February of 1945, are actually have a little bit better machining than guns made in 44, at least some of them, because they were getting pretty darn rough. As I said in my Type 14 video, Kokubunji would stop making the Type 14 in August of 1944, and then they would focus only on making these, so they would up their quality. In late 1944, around, it's hard to say exactly because they would kind of use them intermittently, but they would introduce these slab wooden grips as opposed to the polymer. And these are pretty strong, at least compared to the slab grips on the Type 14, because it's thicker wood and they're shorter grips. They would introduce what is called today by collectors a square back cocking knob here. It's a simple square chunk with simple vertical grooves as opposed to the thumb indents of the earlier style. This would be introduced around January of 1945. They would also simplify the rear sights. Now we just have two square posts as opposed to the original. We have still a very simple rear sight, but more complicated to machine, relatively speaking. This is the late style blued magazine. The base is pretty similar, but the body is a rougher finish and rougher stamping. They also simplified the loading thing here. It's a simple button now as opposed to a much more complicated loading thing, which you can even use a tool to assist with. There would be an interim step where you'd see this style of mag but blued in 42 and 43, but by 44, 45 they would go to the simplified mag there. The bluing, as I said, would be pretty well simplified, almost kind of taking on a gray appearance with time. The safety's changed up a little bit. The machining here is simplified. The lanyard loop, for some reason, is a little bit bigger. We still have a grip safety. Machining here is simplified. We have a simple step now as opposed to more rounded features. Just little areas where they could make these faster. Whatever they could do to turn them out just a little bit faster, they would do. In total, they would produce about 71,000, maybe 72,000 Type 94s. Not a large number. In fact, about one Type 94 was made for every 4 Type 14s. But that said, a still larger number than total Type 26 revolver production, which was around 60,000. So they managed to turn out more of these in 10 years than they did of 30 years of Type 26 production. Japanese soldiers like these, generally speaking. They were a little bit smaller, well, actually quite a bit. We have about a 3.9-inch barrel, so nearly an inch shorter than the Type 14. Plus the action back here is smaller. Shorter gun overall. It's a little bit lighter. The grip is quite small and compact, which fit the Japanese hand quite well and is pretty reminiscent of a CCW type gun even today. We have a more usable safety here, 1911 style, plus the magazine disconnect safety. We're hammer fired instead of being striker fired. We also have a stronger firing pin thanks to not having to have a little tail on the bottom. So this is a more reliable, durable gun. It's kind of closed in more. Yeah, mechanically, it's a more reliable piece. And we're still firing this standard issue 8mm round. We're not having to use like a 32 or something smaller like that. So soldiers appreciated that. Compact, easy to use, pretty low maintenance. The problems were, there we go, that it was harder to disassemble. You drive this wedge here out, and from there the gun kind of auto disassembles, which is easy enough. But reassembly, you can get good at it, but it's definitely more time consuming, I would think, than the Type 14, although it itself isn't the master of simplicity. Also, the trigger is not great. The Type 14 really has a good trigger. The Type 94 can range anywhere from fine to horrible, with horrible being most of the late war guns. But it's a military trigger, it works. Of course, the biggest thing you hear about in America is this exposed sear here. This right here. So let me take the mag out. If it's cocked, you normally would pull the trigger. But if you do press in here, and notice it's actually indented into the frame, so you have to press in an indent, you can make it fire. That said, if you have your safety on, that's not going to happen because the safety physically blocks this bar because it tips out back here, if you notice. When I pull the trigger, that tips out. Of course, I have my magazine out right now, so I can't pull it anyway. Now, you can fire them. This is true. But you almost have to do it willfully. And of course, Japanese soldiers would carry it either without a round in the chamber or with the safety on in the first place. I'm not really making excuses for it. This sear, the way it was done, was kind of necessary to make this as compact and slim. It was just kind of mechanically part of it. And the Japanese military never saw a problem with it. There are no reports of Japanese soldiers accidentally shooting themselves because of it, because you really have to do it quite deliberately. The reports of Japanese soldiers holding it like this and trying to surrender it to Americans, like you would be at the camera right here, are bunkus. No American soldier in his right mind would let a Japanese point a gun at him, even with his finger away from the trigger, because just as easy as he might squeeze it here, he could quickly grab the trigger. No soldier would let a Japanese get that close with the muzzle pointing at him. I don't care. That's just made up stories. As far as suicide guns, that's also made up. A Japanese soldier isn't going to have his gun out. If he's surrendering, the gun's not in his hand. It's on the ground. That would be the first thing an American soldier would require, put the gun down. So if they want to shoot themselves, they're going to do it before even getting to the Americans to surrender. It's just fanciful stories. People saw this sear and kind of dreamed up stories to go along with it. Hey, there weren't near as many television channels back in the 50s, and, you know, you can only read so many books. You had to kind of sit around and make up stories while having drinks, right? So it's an interesting gun to me. I think it feels nice, and for a long time these were terribly undervalued. They're starting to get a little more recognition today, but with fewer than 72,000 ever made, it's quite a rare gun. It would be used by the Japanese, of course, during World War II. Afterwards, it would pop up in East Asia occasionally. Quite a few were left behind in China, Vietnam, Korea, Thailand, other places. So some places would use these. It's obviously more defensive guns. Same problem though as with the Type 14. It fired the 8mm rounds, so as ammunition ran out, most of them were kind of chunked away. But it's an interesting part of history. Actually, it's quite fun to shoot. Has an interesting recoil impulse because of how the system works. But yeah, thought we would just revisit it. One of my favorites. Maybe because they were just so under talked about, and when you did hear about them, it was half the time just about that darn sear. Since I don't think anyone's going to be carrying a Type 94 as a concealed gun today, it's really, for a military gun, fine. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. As always, we really appreciate you tuning in. If you liked the video, please click like. If you haven't already subscribed and have time to do so, we'd really appreciate that. This is Misha. Please tune in again next time for more, hopefully, unique and interesting videos. We'll catch you then.